So before we talk about the Audient in particular, the first thing I want to talk about is why do we need a large format console, and what's the point? Like what role does our console play in our recording process? And this is probably something that you talked about when you talked about your the Mackie 1604, and we're just going to talk about it again, but this time in my terms, in my language. So first of all, we have two different paths when we're doing recordings. We have the recording path or the input path, and then we have the monitor path, the path that we listen to. So we have the path that's going into our recording machine, whatever that is, if it's a tape machine, if it's a computer, if it's some kind of piece of hardware, whatever it is, the recorder. So we're recording the sound from the source into the recorder. And then we also need to listen to that. We need to listen to it on the other side of things to make sure that the recording sounds really nice. So first of all, if you look here at my picture here, you've got the source, and the source is, in this case, it's a person singing. So the source is actually their throat right here, and it goes into the air, and it goes to the microphone, and the microphone takes that into the console, and that console is a mixing console, Mackie 1604, Audient, SSL, whatever it is. And then from there, that goes into your recording device, whatever your recording device is. And the recording device can be, like I said, a multi-track tape machine. It can be a computer with Logic or Pro Tools or something on it, or it could be a ADAT machine, multi-track recorder that's digital. But the main point really is that you've got something where you can record every instrument individually. You can record your vocals, you can record your kick drum, you can record your snare drum, you can record your guitar, you can record your bass. Everything's individual. So once we get it in there, then we can start to play with the mix, and we can mix those things individually. You don't want to just have it set up where you've got two microphones and it records just two microphones and there you go, because then you don't have any control over your mix later on. That's how bands used to do it back in the 50s and early 60s, and it was around the 60s that the multi-track mixing consoles and the multi-track recorders started coming in, and people were able to record with the multi-track recorders on a broad scale. It was actually developed before that, but on a broad scale, the 60s is when all the studios started to get it. So some of the earliest bands that recorded with multi-track recorders, some of the famous ones are like the Beatles, people recording back in that time period. So that's your first console there. Your first mixing console is going to feed into your recorder. And then you need something to mix it on. So it comes out of the recorder into another console. And that's where you can actually do the mix. And that's the one we're going to listen to. That's our speakers are plugged into that, and we can listen to it on that end of things. And that would be the monitor path. So this box over here that's in red, that's the mixing console for our recording path. That's our input path. And this box that is pink over here, this is our monitor path. And we read up here, the input path feeds the signal into the recorder. And the monitor path is what we listen to make sure there are no problems with the recording. Well, having two different mixing consoles in a room can get really bulky and take up a lot of space. And so those mixing consoles are combined into one machine, one device that does everything right there. Because essentially what we're doing with stuff over here on our input path is the same as what we're doing stuff on our monitor path. It's just going to a different place. The monitor path is going to our speakers, it's going to our 2-track machine so we can record it, so we can listen to it on an MP3 or CD or something. And the input path is going into our computer. But they have all the same parts. They have channels to make them louder and softer, like faders to make them louder and softer. They've got EQs, some consoles have compression, all that same stuff on both sides. So we combine those two consoles into one unit. And that's what we're working with there. So just a little reiteration here. The input path is the path from the source to the recorder, and the monitor path is the path from the recorder to the speakers. And that's what we listen to. We listen to the monitor path. So there are two types of large format consoles. There's a split channel console, and this is what you already have familiarity with the Mackie 1604. That's where the input path and the monitor path are on two separate channels. So in this case here, If we have a console that's 8 channels, we would have 4 channels of input path and 4 channels of monitor path. So with this 8-channel mixer, if we're using the input and monitor path, how we're describing it here in this lesson, then you're only going to have 4 channels of capability to record. Okay, so even though you have an 8-channel mixer, you can only record 4 channels because your input path is 4 channels, your monitor path is 4 channels. So your 1604, those two numbers is the first number is your input path, how many inputs you have, and the other numbers, the first 2 numbers of the input path are the channels, and then the other 2 numbers are your buses. So 1604, that means there's 16 channels and there's 4 buses. Different ones do different things like that, but in this case it's that the 1604 is, and the 1604 has 16 channels. So it's got 8 for the monitor path and 8 for the input path. If you're looking at it, or sorry, yeah, 8 for the monitor path, 8 for the input path, but flip those, 8 for the input path, 8 for the monitor path. But if you're actually looking at it, you might just go, well, but Tony, the channels all look the same. Yes, the channels all look the same on a 1604, on the Audient, on the SSL, whatever. The channels all look the same. It's not that the channels are put into the categories by anything that's separated on the board itself, because you can use the board for different things. It doesn't have to be for recording. As a matter of fact, most people probably aren't using the Mackie 1604 particularly for recording. A lot of people are probably using it for live venues and stuff like that, for live stuff. So they might not be recording it, they might just be using it to mix. So they need, say, we have 16 microphones, we need 16 channels, so they use all 16 channels for microphones, or some for microphones, some for keyboards. Maybe not for anything for recording. But in our case, we're specifically talking about using things in the recording studio. So the Mackie 1604 is going to have 8 channels that we're going to delegate towards the input path, and then 8 channels that we're going to delegate to the monitor path. So we're going to split it kind of ourselves. We're splitting it, so it's 8 channels there for the input path and 8 channels for the monitor path. And in this case here, I've just got 4 channels and 4 channels here, just an 8, but that's just because I just didn't want to write 16 lines across here. But we got the vocals, guitar, bass, and kazoo, because every good band needs a kazoo, of course, right? So you got the vocals here, the guitars, the bass, and the kazoo here, 1, 2, 3, and 4. And the monitor path, technically it's channels 5, 6, 7, and 8, but it's still the vocals, guitar, bass, and kazoo. So most consumer boards fall into this category here, where you've got the split channels there, your input path on one side, your monitor path on the other side. But when you record, you only listen to your monitor path channels. Now, you will have to listen to the input path to make sure that the input path is working okay. But really, when you're doing the recording, when you're listening to everything, you want to listen to it after your recording device, after the multi-channel mixer. And the reason why we're listening to it after the multi-channel mixer is because we want to make sure that there's no problems with the sound going into the mixer itself. If you're listening to the monitor path, all you're listening to is half the journey. Because remember, what's happening here is the audio is taking a journey. It's starting at the source, like if we're singing la, it's starting here and it's journeying into the microphone, through the board, into the recorder, right? And if we want to make sure that it's getting all the way through that journey intact, all the way through all the cables it has to go through, all the pieces of gear that it has to go through, and getting to its destination intact, well, we have to listen to it after the destination, not before the destination, but after the destination. Because if we listen after the destination, then we can ensure a safe journey of that audio signal. But if we stop and we listen to it only on the input path of the mixer, well, there's still another half the journey to go until it gets into the recording device. So we always have to listen to everything after the recording device, and that's the monitor path. Now, on an inline console, it's exactly the same, except for we're not splitting the channels. Now what's happening is each channel has both an input path and a monitor path. They're on the same channel, the input path and the monitor path. And you actually have 2 faders on every single channel. You have a fader up top and you have a fader down below it. this fader up top is usually shorter and the fader down below it is usually longer. And so we're going to call this one the short fader and this one down here the long fader. And with the Audient especially, every time you use it, the default position is the short fader is your input path and the long fader is your monitor path. So it kind of keeps things a bit easier to identify. And we can see here in my little drawing here, I've got the input path on top and I've got the monitor path here on the bottom. And remember, when recording, you only listen to the monitor path. Well, so now, instead of just having 4 instruments, we can have all kinds of instruments. We can have our vocals, guitar, bass, and kazoo, but then we could have a separate mic for our bass drum, a separate mic for our snare drum, and a separate mic and 2 separate mics for our overheads, overhead left and overhead right here. So we can add drums into this. The vocals, guitar, bass, and kazoo are now added into the party is being made better by the drums. So that's what's going on in this illustration here. But because we have 8 channels here and it's an inline console, we actually can have 8 channels of recording on the input path and 8 channels of monitoring on the monitor path there. So the whole point, the whole entire point of having an inline console really is just to save space. You can have twice as many channels in the same footprint. So if I have my console over here and it's split channel, then this one here is going to have only 4 channels of recording capability because it's right here on it's side by side. But on our inline console, everything has 2 input path and a monitor path on each channel. So we're just saving space. Because if we start getting into like a 64 channel mixer, that means that you'd have to have 128 channels, right, going across for recording if you wanted to record 64 channels at the same time. So that would be too big for any room really. So we can bring that down and put it into a smaller space. So that saves a lot of space in here. And that's really why we have an inline console. So that's the whole point of why we have these consoles like this, why we're using them and everything like that. So if you have any questions about that, we can talk about that in the Zoom. I think will probably be the easiest place to kind of talk about it because we're talking about concepts here. And once you kind of wrap your head around this concept, everything moving forward is going to be it's all the same stuff. So this is not something that you need to relearn ever again. You just need to take this knowledge and apply this. And again, like I said, hopefully this is review. Hopefully you went over this when you talked about the Mackie 1604 and you're kind of remembering it. And we're going to talk about this again when we get to the O2R later on in this module, and then you're going to talk about it again when you talk about the SSL. So we're going to be hearing about this a lot. Okay? All right, so a little bit about some of the equipment that we're going to be using when we're talking about recording. The first thing that's really important is the Multitrack Recorder. This is just a generic term for all devices that can record multiple tracks at the same time. Anything that can record multiple tracks at the same time is the Multitrack Recorder, and we shorten this to MTR. Okay? The letters MTR just stand for Multitrack Recorder. Multitrack Recorder can be a DAW, it can be an ADAT, which is Alesis audio, digital audio tape, and it can also be a multitrack, actually a multitrack tape machine, which would be 24 tracks and or 2 tracks. So a DAW stands for Digital Audio Workstation. I often just say DAW, a lot of people just say DAW. This is like Pro Tools, Logic, Ableton Live, FL Studio, anything like that. The thing with a DAW is that it needs a computer and an audio interface. You need both of those components. You need the computer and you need the audio interface. Now, the computer itself, the software these days can just use pretty much unlimited tracks. Pro Tools, I think the limit is 256 tracks of audio, and I think with Logic it's something like that as well, but it might be unlimited. Ableton Live I know is unlimited. Your limit just comes from your processor power on your computer. The real limit that you have for how many tracks you can record at the same time is your audio interface. The audio interface is the piece of hardware that gets the audio from the analog world, changes it into digital information, and puts it into the computer. and that has a certain amount of inputs and outputs on it. So that's really the bottleneck. That's your main constraint when you're dealing with all this stuff. So that's if you only have an 8-channel audio interface, then you can only record 8 channels. It doesn't matter how big your mixer is, you can only record 8 channels. If I have an audio interface that's 24 channels, great, then I can record 24 channels at the same time. So with the Audient has 24 outputs, so we can technically record 24 channels at the same time. Our audio interface in that room also has 24 inputs and 24 outputs, so we can listen to 24, we can monitor input path 24 channels, and we can also monitor on the monitor path 24 channels at the same time. So that room is particularly well set up. We're going to be talking about that again when we get to the O2R, and you're going to see how things are a bit different on the O2R. We have, next is the Alesis digital audio tape, which is ADAT. That's an 8-channel recorder. It looks kind of like a VHS cassette, and it was popular from the 90s into the 2000s. It's not something that people really use too much anymore because the computers kind of took over everything. But you might still see it a little bit in use today, occasionally, especially for like if you're recording on the road or something like that, in like kind of a situation like a live situation. But the reason why we still talk about ADAT is because you'll see people talking about the ADAT cable. In the ADAT cable, it's also called light pipe. It's an 8-channel digital audio cable. We still use it today. It's one cable that can handle 8 channels of audio at 44.1 or 4 channels of audio at 96K. Okay, so depending on the sample rate, it can handle more or less channels of audio. So if you're doing normal recording at 44.1 or 48 kilohertz sample rate, then you can do 8 channels of audio through one cable. It's an optical cable, and it's actually got a little light that shines through it. The inside is made from really thin glass filaments, and you can actually have 8 channels through one cable. But if you're recording at higher sample rates, 96 or 88.2 or 96 kilohertz, then it can only do 4 channels because this audio is taking up more data bandwidth. Okay, so that's the ADAT cable. That's why we still talk about ADAT today. But you might actually still see an ADAT machine somewhere. I know we have one at SAE. We don't really use it too much, but if you wanted to learn how to use it, we can definitely show you how to do that. But it's really not something that you're going to see around too much in the real world. Next is the 24-track tape machine. Tape machines are not really used that much today. You can still find studios occasionally that do use them, but the thing is, tape machines, they're really expensive to upkeep. They break often, a lot of parts to go wrong, a lot of parts to go bad, stuff like that. So that's why we don't really use tape machines that much anymore. Also, they're expensive and they're hard to get. And finally, and probably one of the biggest reasons, is that editing audio on a digital workstation is so much easier. It's non-destructive. You can keep all the audio. You can keep extra audio. Whereas with the tape machine, if you have 24 tracks and you need to record another track, well then you're going to have to record over some part of your original 24 tracks. So, or you're going to have to bounce them down in some way. So people don't really use tape machines so much anymore, mostly because they are kind of difficult to use, they're expensive to upkeep, and tape is expensive. Just the expense, just kind of, and it's hard to edit and stuff like that. So you might still see, some people recording to tape for like certain things maybe, but they're also hard to find these days in studios. I mean, they're constantly breaking and stuff like that. So I don't know if we're still using tape machines at SAE. I know we were. We might still use them occasionally, but really it's hard to find a studio that actually still has a working tape machine in it. So that's a bit rough there. Now, a 2-track tape machine, you'll still see those. You'll still see them in mastering studios, things like that. I've been to mastering studios where they still have them. They're less expensive. There's less channels to deal with. But tape is still expensive. It's becoming more and more rare, harder to get your hands on. So these are kind of going away as well. If you can use one, or if you can find one, it's really cool to have one around. But there's a lot of extra problems that kind of happen that come with having tape machines like that. All right, so again, if you have any questions about this, we can talk about it in the Zoom portion of class. So now, let's talk about the two different paths we have. We have the input path and we have the monitor path here. And this is a little diagram here that's going to come back again and again and again. We're going to be talking about this week. We're going to be talking about it in the O2R. You're probably going to be talking about it in the SSL. So this is really important. And actually, I do want you to memorize this. This is something that I want you to kind of commit to memory and write it down. I've got like a blank page of this so I can, so you can use that to kind of help you write into it and memorize it and stuff like that. So we are going to take time to actually try to get this memorized. But let's just go over it here today. And you may have gone over this again with Ryan in your first class. I'm not really sure if he goes over this stuff, but I think he does. So we start with the source. The source can be all sorts of stuff. It can be your voice, it can be a guitar, it can be a bass, it can be a keyboard, it can be a drum. And depending on what the source is, the sound gets transmitted. If the sound is your voice, it gets transmitted through the air. If the sound is a guitar, it gets transmitted through a cable. If it's a keyboard, it goes through a cable. If it's a drum, it goes through the air. And it gets transmitted and goes into the microphone. The microphone picks it up. So if I'm singing, I've got my microphone here, and I'm singing la 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 la, and I sing, and the sound goes from here, and it transmits through the air, it moves the airwaves, and it goes into the microphone right here. Well, the microphone is connected with a cable, this cable here, and the cable is patched into the back of my mic pre-input. And that can be either a separate box, or it can be part of your console. So every console, anything that has a microphone input into it, has a pre built into it. And what the pre does is it just brings up the level of that signal there, because the signal is not super loud going into the microphone. The microphone is not, the level of the microphone is not very loud. So we need to make that louder and bring it up to what we call line level, which is what we can actually work with, what we can record and stuff. So in order to do that, the mic pre has a gain on it, has a gain that actually brings up the level of the microphone, of what's happening in there. And that can happen, like I said, it can be an external box, or it can be part of the mixer. And this is where the cost comes in. You can have mic pre's that cost $100, $150, or you can have a mic pre that costs $2,000. And how clean that signal is, how nice that signal sounds when it gets turned up by that mic pre, that's where the cost comes in. Now, as the technology has marched through time and we've moved into the future, from the first mic pre's in the 50s up to now, the technology has gotten way better. So nowadays, you can get a mic pre that sounds great for a low cost. But you can also spend a lot of money on them as well. And really what you're doing is you're spending money on the character, you're spending money on the sound, like how good does it sound, how clean is it, how much character does it have, stuff like that. Like the name behind it, how famous it is, how it's made. All these kind of elements come into play here. But the reality is you can get a really good sound for a fraction of the cost as 30, 40, 50 years ago. Excuse me. So you have the mic pre input. Now, if the mic pre is part of the mixing console, then the next part here, this assigned part here, it doesn't really matter. You're assigning it by plugging into the channel 1, channel 2, channel 3, channel 4, because it's all connected up. But if your mic pre is separate from your console, then you're going to assign it by plugging it into the back of the console itself. So you go from your mic pre, a separate box, you're going to use another cable to plug it into the back of your console, and that goes into your channel. And the channel is a channel strip, and it's comprised of a few different things. You've got your EQ on there a lot of times, you've got your sends, and then you've got your level, which is the fader. So that goes into that channel there. And the channel then is routed somehow into our MTR, but it's going to go through a couple steps. First of all, you're using a routing matrix of some sort to route it into your either group outs or direct outs. Usually it's a button that you have to press. On the Audient, you've got a routing matrix that looks like this here on the screen right now. And on the O2R, you've just got a button that says output there, and it's just going to send it out. So they're slightly different, and how they work is slightly different, but essentially you're doing the same thing. You're sending it out of the console into your multi-track recorder. And this is another cable here. So this route here, you're routing it you're using a button. And then it goes outside of the machine, and using a cable, it's patched into the multi-track recorder. So if we want to send it out, if we're coming into channel 1, we're going to push the button for channel 1, and we're going to go into our multi-track recorder and probably use channel 1. That's called one-to-one routing. We're going to come back and talk about that in a little bit. So let's just go over this one more time. We start with the source. The source transmits through some kind of medium, the air, a cable, something like that, into our microphone. The microphone uses a cable that's patched into the mic pre-input, which is assigned by using another cable to patch it into the channel. So we're assigning it to a channel that we want to use, and that is routed by pushing a button on the group out or the direct out, and that goes out of the console with another cable into the multi-track recorder. So that is our input path, and that's where it gets recorded. And the multi-track recorder, just remember, that's so we can record everything multi-track. We can record on multiple different tracks. And that, again, is, a tape machine, the max usually was like a 24 channel machine. And in the DAW world, we can have as many channels as we want, really. And remember, your bottleneck is the audio interface in modern times. All right, so next we have the monitor path. The monitor path is after the multi-track recorder, and remember, this is what we're going to be hearing. So the reason why we listen on the monitor path is because our input path has all of these steps here, so many steps. This part here, one mic pre, channel, and group out, this is all part of the console, but then we have all these cables and things that are happening on either side of this. So over here, let me just get my cursor up here so we can see what's going on. So here, these two here, this is before the console. These three here are inside the console, and then we have another cable here on the going from the console to the multi-track recorder. Well, you just see, before we get to the multi-track recorder, there's all kinds of places where problems can happen. So what we want to make sure we're doing is we're listening on the monitor path to make sure that no problems are actually happening. Okay? And I know we're adding some more things in here, but again, as long as everything's okay, we're doing fine here. So the monitor path, we start with the multi-track recorder. So the multi-track recorder is doing two things. One, it's recording information from our input path, but two, it's also playing back stuff that's previously been recorded. So we're monitoring the stuff that's previously been recorded, and we can mix it. And that's what's happening with our monitor path. So the monitor path is doing two things. The multi-track recorder, when we're monitoring, is doing two things. It's playing back previously recorded material that we can listen to while we're recording new material. So it's recording stuff and it's playing back stuff. So this one here, basically we're just going in reverse of where we were just doing. So multi-track recorder here is patched back into the console. And that's going to be our line in or our tape in. That's patched using a cable, and it goes into our line in or our tape in because it's a line level signal. And that is assigned to the channel, same way. So if I want to come into channel 1, I'm going to patch it into the line or tape in on channel 1, and that's assigning it to channel 1. And channel 1 has EQs, sometimes it's got compressors, sometimes it's got, it's usually got an aux send, something like that, and it's also got the fader for our level, so we can control the level. Then we push a button to route the signal to our left-right mix bus. The left-right mix bus is our main fader on the board. It's what we're actually hearing when we're recording down our bounce for our 2-track, all that stuff. The left-right mix bus is everything is mixed together. That's two channels, left and right. It's sometimes called the stereo mix bus. It's the left-right mix bus on the Audient, and it's just two channels, left and right, and we've got that there. And that's what we're hearing, like whenever you listen to an MP3, if you listen to a CD, if you listen to a wave, whatever you're listening to, what you're listening to is the left-right mix bus. Okay? So what happens then is that is assigned to the control room out. And you usually got a couple places it can go out so we can listen to it, but the control room out is the main place. That's what we are listening to. You can also send it to a stereo out or like studio out, and the studio out would be like if your musicians are listening, they can listen to it on the studio out. So a couple different places this can go, but the main place for us mix engineers is our control room out, and then this is hardwired into some speakers. So we've got some nice speakers there, and it goes into those speakers, and that's where we're actually hearing it through the speakers. So just one more time with this monitor path. You've got the multi-track recorder that's patched into the line or tape in, which is a 1/4-inch input on the back of the console. Wherever you patch it in, that's going to assign it to the channel where you can control the level, you can mix it together. You push a button to route it to the left-right mix bus. The left-right mix bus has one main fader. That's your main fader overall that's going out to your 2-track machine, so you can record it all down so people can listen to it. But in the meantime, we need to listen to it, so that's where we assign it to the proper output here. In our case, it's going to be our control room out. If you're sending it to your musicians to listen to, that's going to be the studio out. And then this here is hardwired with a cable, again, into some speakers. And those speakers don't change. Wherever we route it from the control room out, that's the speakers we're routing it to, and then we're going to listen to it on those speakers. Usually most studios have 2 or 3 different pairs of monitors that we can listen to it on. Okay? And that's our input path and our monitor path. Input path and the monitor path. So this is all stuff that before we actually get to the Audient, this is the kind of stuff that we are talking about. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a little break now, because I do want to stop the video. I'm going to go ahead and stop recording right here.